Welcome to examples for doing composition of functions. Example 1. We want to determine f of g of x, and then we want to determine g of f of x for the two functions f of x equals 4x minus 5 and g of x is equal to negative 3x squared. Finally, we want to answer the question, does f of g of x equal g of f of x? So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to write down, we're going to try to find f of g of x as our first problem. So we'll call that part A. F of g of x. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write down my f of x function, and then I'm going to substitute g of x for each x in the f of x equation. So in place of the x right here, I'm going to plug in g of x, which is negative 3x squared. After I've done that, then I'm going to simplify. So let's go ahead and substitute this in. So we have 4, take out the x, put some parentheses, so that I have a space to plug in the negative 3x squared. So into those parentheses I'm going to plug negative 3x squared, and then after I've done that I'm going to simplify. So f of g of x so far is equal to 4 times negative 3x squared minus 5. Go ahead and pause so that you can get this written down. Now I'm going to start the second step, which is simplify. So now I'm going to simplify this expression. Can't do anything inside the parentheses, so all I can do right now is I can multiply 4 times negative 3, and if I multiply that, I get negative 12. I've got an x squared that I can attach to that, so 4 times negative 3x squared is negative 12x squared minus 5. I look at my two terms, I see that they have nothing in common, so I can't do anything else to this problem. So f of g of x is equal to negative 12x squared minus 5. So I have found my first composition of functions. Go ahead and pause, and when you're ready to continue, hit the play button again. Okay, now we're ready to continue with the second part of our problem. Now we're finding g of f of x, so we've flipped around the order. This time we're going to be substituting the f of x equation in for each x in our g of x equation. So starting with g of x, I've got negative 3x squared. So I'm going to be taking out this x and I'm going to be replacing it with some parentheses. Now notice that the f of x function is 4x minus 5. So as I'm plugging f of x in here, I'm going to be plugging in the entire 4x minus 5 into the parentheses. Again, my first step is to plug in f of x for each x in the g of x equation. So I took out x and I replaced it with 4x minus 5. Go ahead and pause so that you can write this down. Okay, now we're ready to go to step 2, which is to simplify. So we need to take our negative 3 parentheses 4x minus 5 squared, and we need to simplify that. And once we have simplified that, we will have determined g of f of x. So let's go ahead and start. Remember order of operations, see if you can simplify what's in the parentheses. 4x minus 5 is already simplified, so now I need to go to my exponent. I'm multiplying 4x minus 5 times itself, so we're going to have to do a little foiling. So g of f of x is going to be equal to negative 3 times 4x minus 5 times 4x minus 5. Now, because I'm multiplying something times itself, I have to be very careful. Bring the negative 3 along for the ride, so bring down the negative 3. Now we're going to be multiplying 4x times 4x. We get 16x squared. That was first times first. Now we're going to do outside times outside. We get negative 20x. Inside times inside. We get negative 20x. And last times last, we get a positive 25. Simplifying what's in the parentheses, I've got negative 3 times 16x squared. Notice the two middle terms are exactly the same. So I get negative 40x plus 25. Last step in the simplification process, now I need to distribute this negative 3 to each one of my numbers inside the parentheses. So negative 3 times 16x squared is negative 48x squared. Negative 3 times negative 40x is a positive 120x. And negative 3 times 25 is a negative 75. This is now g of f of x, and it has been simplified. So finally, we're ready to answer that last question. Is f of g of x equal to g of f of x? For f of g of x, we got negative 12x squared minus 5, and for g of f of x, we got negative 48x squared plus 120x minus 75, and as you can see, the two are not equal. Sometimes they will be, but most of the time they are not. When they are equal, we will talk more about that and what that means. But for this situation, f of g of x is not equal to g of f of x. Go ahead and pause and finish copying your notes. Alright, welcome back. Example number 2, and then we will be finished. This time we want to determine f of g of x, g of f of x, and g of f of negative 2 for the functions f of x equals x squared minus 9, and g of x is equal to the square root of 9 minus x squared. We're going to follow the same two steps we did before. First one we're going to do is we're going to do part A. So we are going to be determining f of g of x. Now remember that this little way that we're writing it means the same thing as f of g of x. So they mean exactly the same thing no matter which way it's written. So I am going to be, number 1, substituting square root of 9 minus x squared in for each x in the f of x equation. So I'm going to be replacing x with 9 minus x squared. So the first thing I'm going to do is write down my f of x function. It's equal to x squared minus 9. And in place of that x right there, I'm going to take it out. I'm going to put in some parentheses. And I'm going to be replacing that x with the square root of 9 minus x squared. So square root 9 minus x squared goes in for the x. It's just taking out the x and replacing it. Minus 9 is going to stay the same out here to the side. After I've substituted, my next step is to simplify. So substitute and simplify. That's what you're repeating each time that you do this. So now I'm ready to simplify. When I square a square root, the square undoes the square root, so I'm only left with what is underneath that radical. So I'm left with 9 minus x squared. On the outside, I also have this minus 9 that I'm bringing down. And finalizing my simplification, this 9 and this minus 9 cancel each other out. So I am left with negative x squared as my answer to part A, which was f of g of x. Go ahead and pause and write this down if you've not already done. Alright, part B, g of f of x is equal to g of f of x, whichever way you write it. First thing we're going to do is we're going to write down g of x, which is 9 minus x squared, square root of the entire quantity. We're going to substitute in x squared minus 9 for each x in g of x. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm taking out the x and I'm replacing it with parentheses, into which I'm going to plug in x squared minus 9. So this is my f of x. I'm replacing x with x squared minus 9, which is my f of x. So we are now in the process of finding g of f of x. Next step, we need to simplify, step 2. So this requires me to square x squared minus 9. So let's go ahead and do that. I have 9 minus x squared minus 9 times x squared minus 9. Order of operations, I have to multiply first before I subtract. So 9 minus x squared times x squared is x to the 4th. Negative 9 times x squared, negative 9x squared. Negative 9 times x squared, negative 9x squared. Negative 9 times negative 9, positive 81. Now we're subtracting. Sometimes compositions of functions get to be really ugly really fast. You can see that on this one. So we got 9, take away everything that's on the inside. So minus x to the 4th, minus a minus becomes a plus, 9x squared, minus a minus, plus 9x squared, and then minus a positive 81 becomes a minus 81. These two are like terms, and 9 minus 81 is also going to be a like term. So we end up with negative x to the 4th, negative x to the 4th. This one and this one will combine together in just a moment. 9 and 9 makes 18x squared, and then 9 take away 81 is a negative 72. So g of f of x is equal to square root negative x to the 4th plus 18x squared minus 72, which you can see is not equal to f of g of x. They were not equal because they did not come out to be the same amount. Finally, we're going to finish up with part C, which asked us to find g of f of negative 2. So now we're going to take our g of f function that we just discovered, and we're going to plug negative 2 into that and see what we get. So we're going to take, for each x, we're going to replace with a negative 2. So we've got negative 2 to the 4th. Remember, take out your x, replace it with parentheses, plug your number into the parentheses, plus 18, parentheses, squared, plug a negative 2 in there, minus 72. Simplify. Negative 2 to the fourth is negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2, which is a positive 16. On the inside, I've got my negative still on the outside, plus negative 2 squared, positive 4, so I've got 18 times a positive 4, and then minus 72. 18 times 4, my next order of operation step, 18 times 4 is 72, so I've got a negative 16 plus 72 minus 72. If we finish up the math on this, negative 16 plus 72 minus 72, those cancel. I end up with the square root of a negative 16. And from Algebra 2, you should remember that we can't take the square root of a negative number over the real numbers. So in this particular case, I would say there is no solution, because the square root of a negative 16 does not exist unless you're dealing with imaginaries, which right now we're only dealing with the reals, so it's not real. Therefore, no solution. Thank you. Have a good evening. See you tomorrow. Bye.